Hello all, I'm Kel Kidman and welcome to Breaking on the Daily, where today we begin with some university nonsense because you see, segregation's back in vogue, with one of the most explicit examples of such coming out just today, with Columbia University announcing that they're going to have separate graduations for people based on race and economic class and all these sorts of other characteristics. And man, this has been a long time coming, really, because they've been trying to do this for a very long time, ever since the introduction of affirmative action. There has been a lot that has happened on this front, one of which being Asian Americans actually being limited, or Asians more generally being limited in terms of their ability to actually get into schools, against any other ethnic group, because too many people get in, too many Asians get in. And there has even been an update on this with the GOP calling for the Yale president to testify in a hearing on discrimination against them. But I found this Columbia story to be incredibly interesting, with much of this being just so interesting to think about. And you know what I wanted to do, and I'm really excited to do this today, is I want to take this to the absolute extreme, to go absolutely as far out as I can go and think about it, just through it all, to see exactly how far this can go. Because, you see, they've only gone, I'd say, around half the way you could on the intersectionality logic train, where you could be going a whole lot farther. So let's try and do a bit of a thought experiment to see exactly how woke we can get. Now, to first start off with this, we need to get a baseline, and that baseline is going to be based on what Columbia is actually doing, and just so that we can understand kind of where they're coming from and what the sort of things we could potentially be seeing will be doing. Now, they've been mostly basing this on race, ethnicity, and, strangely enough, income status. Essentially, people who are less fortunate and had crappier parents are going to be separated from people who had better parents, because we want to pretend as though something oppression. And they're also doing this on the basis of race and ethnicity. So essentially, depending on where you're coming from, you have different examples of graduation. Now, where can we take this? Now, the obvious next step is to segregate it based on sex, to separate men and women into different groups, into different categories, to have graduation in different places, in order to, have less male violence, I guess. I don't know. Next obvious thing would be to separate based on sexuality. All right, that's another thing that would be the next step, where we're just going to have the gays and the lesbians off in a different area, and we're just going to have all of the, normal people who are going to be in one area or multiple areas, depending on their race, ethnicity, income status, and sex as well. Okay, and then next we move on to gender? I don't know. Next we move on to gender, and we separate the trannies from everyone else, and then we separate also all of the non-binary folk into all of their separate categories, depending on where they wish to be. And you know what you end up with at the end of all of this? What you end up with is essentially all of these collectivized groups of people who are separated from each other, hating each other, and having huge groups of particular people who are in the majority, who don't particularly like any of the other people because, well, they don't interact with them at all, and potentially any interactions that they do have with them are hostile because of the nature of the environment in which they are being educated, in this case. And you end up with a whole lot of strife and problems. Man, this seems like a really fun new way to go about this. There is so much problems with schooling today, and this isn't all, because we're going to be focusing a lot on schooling in this episode of Breaking on the Daily, though our next story is not directly about schooling, but rather, more specifically, children, with children are now having the COVID-19 vaccine, particularly from Moderna, being tested on them, where they are having kids and infants being tested with the COVID-19 vaccine. And this has an inordinate amount of problems. First of all, starting with the fact, and the well-established fact at this point, that children and infants are not affected by COVID-19 almost at all. Most people, children who get COVID, don't feel it. don't know they have it. And when they get it, they're less reticent to actually pass it on to other people. This has become more and more clear as we have gone on, because the age differential is huge depending on whether you are an old person or whether you are a child. And there hasn't been an epidemic of infant deaths. What this essentially seems to be in terms of COVID-19 and how it's affecting children is essentially a common cold. It's not even a flu necessarily, because they aren't even dying at those sorts of rates. It seems more to me, at least, that it is affecting them much like a cold, and that's what the data seems to suggest. And there's also another problem with this, in that the vaccine itself seems to have the inverse correlation with many young people up to this point being more affected by the vaccine than old people are. It's been kind of convenient that it's been set up into such a clearly defined sort of spectrum and inverse correlation. It has been very convenient to say, well, young people probably don't need to get the vaccine because they're not at risk to COVID in the first place, and they have a higher chance of getting symptoms from the vaccine, and worse symptoms from the vaccine, than old people do. And old people should probably get the vaccine because old people are more risk to COVID-19, and they're at less risk to having symptoms from the vaccine. I don't know exactly why this has been the case, but all of this seems to be fairly well established. So the question has to be asked at that point, especially since these are so well-established facts. Why exactly is this test even being done? Now, there is a certain level of they're just doing it for the science, and that may be the case. It may be the case that they are simply testing to see whether it's safe in the first place, and that is a legitimate venture. That is a legitimate thing to try and do, especially since it's been proven that the vaccines are, by and large, mostly safe. Though there are some questions about it still, it's mostly fine. It's still worth it to look into, obviously, and I wish them the best in that front. But I think the push for this, and what will inevitably be, assuming that this test goes down well, the push for children to get the vaccine as well, will in all likelihood be because of the wilting violets that are absolutely infecting our culture as of late. There has been much said about this, and I'm obviously not the first person to speak on this topic, but it is worth it to continue to mention such, as these people are becoming simply more and more prevalent in many aspects of life. But this isn't the only aspect of life in which wilting violets are getting a whole lot done, and having a whole lot of authoritarian policy be put into place because of COVID-19. Because you see, our next story has to do with a particular story of a NYC judge removing a 6-year-old from her mother's, I think her mother's custody, because she didn't wear a mask while dropping her off at school. This is an utter absurdity. To break down entirely what was happening, the child was being compliant, went into the school with a mask on. The mother was simply in the car and did not have a mask on. Was in her own car. I don't even think she got out of the car at any point, at least from not from what I've seen. And yet, the school nurse, which, by the way, also worth it to mention, the mother is actually a family doctor in this case, someone who you'd expect to have some form of COVID knowledge, at least, is someone who would know about these sorts of things. And the school nurse then comes out and berates the mother. And within weeks, they go to family court, with the estranged father going to family court to try and get full custody. And strangely enough, this seems to be the one example that I have ever found where family court is actually slanted in the direction of the father rather than the mother. And it seems to me that this is based on an ideological fealty test. This is what it seems to me. As I've already established back just a couple of days ago, or I guess almost a week ago at this point, back in my destruction of the mask narrative rant, masks, and I'm not going to bore you with the entire explanation, but masks only at best are effective at stopping 1.5% of all COVID cases. 1.5%. There is a 99% chance that if you come into contact with someone and you would get it anyway, then it's not going to be stopped by the mask. And that is using best case scenario. It is obvious that this is not necessary, particularly within a frickin' private car. And it's gotten to the point where any visitation that the mother has had to this point has to be, one, supervised, and two, she has to have a mask on in her own home. This is how absurd all of this has gotten. And, I don't normally talk about these sorts of stories. I don't find them to be as compelling to talk about as other stories are. As you might have noticed from watching me speak, I'm more of a policy wonk kind of guy. I don't really want to talk about a lot of culture war stuff, but this has really just compelled me to talk about it. Not only because I saw it pretty much as it was coming out from the Gateway Pundit in this case, but because this is just such an absurd case. It is so absurd that the family court has the power to unilaterally remove the child from the home based on things that the government hasn't even mandated at this point. The government, I don't think in any case, has actually mandated that people wear masks in their own private homes, at least not in America. And even such a thing would be obviously unconstitutional. Such a precision would be struck down in court fairly quickly, I imagine. To say this is a child abuse and is worth removing custody from the mother in this case is utter absurdity. And there is not a lot to be done about family court, at least not at this juncture. Family court is a very entrenched thing, and breaking it down entirely for the absolute cesspit it is going to take a very long time. It is not going to be solved in a New York minute, all right? It isn't going to be solved very quickly. And so, how should you deal with not having to deal with family court, at least by and large, in this day and age? Don't mess up your own marriages. Take this example as a way to say, well, maybe I should not have an example where I'm getting estranged from my husband or wife. Maybe I should not be putting myself in the situation where this may become an issue. Maybe I shouldn't concern myself with custody battles by disciplining myself and allowing myself to become better at using relationships. This is the commonality of many people in the West, in the modern West. Many people are completely unwilling to commit to relationships and to actually think before they jump into a specific relationship and even have kids. Because this isn't just harmful to the mother. Though this is clearly harmful to the mother, it is also deeply harmful to the child. Not just the example of the mother losing custody, but also the example of having her mother and father be estranged from each other. This is not a good thing. All right? This mother is not completely innocent in this case because something I haven't mentioned up to this point, the complaint was brought by the father. It wasn't brought by Child Protective Services or anything like that. It wasn't actually directly brought by the government at all. If the mother and father had not been estranged from each other, if they hadn't divorced or been simply promiscuous earlier in life and caused this whole mess to happen, they wouldn't be in family court. There would be nothing here. There would be no story. This was completely avoidable on the part of the mother, but she didn't do it. Because at some point earlier in her life, she was irresponsible. Incredibly so. That's why the child exists, and she's estranged from her husband. That's pretty much that. And that is something you need to take care of, because you do not want to deal with these ideological tests from the family court. And this isn't even all for the ideological tests that have been going on. Because another story, and our last story of the day, is of a teacher, a particular teacher, attempting to essentially dock certain parents for being anti their communistic agenda. And I don't want you to let people get away with being communist, with having these communistic agendas. And, okay, but before I get into that, let's break down actually what was going on in this case. Because, first of all, we start off in a D.C., I believe, school district. And this particular district, which is spelled Loudoun County, it's London with with extra U's. I don't know how to pronounce it, and I'm not interested in learning how to pronounce it. They have been pushing a lot of different nonsense over the past few years, many of which having to do with either banning teachers themselves from disagreeing with critical race theory, not just on campus, but anywhere, because they're employed with this to the school district, and also trying to enroll parents in frickin' diversity training. They have been pushing a lot of this sort of stuff, but in response to a lot of this incredibly divisive and radical rhetoric, there has been a growing resentment and counter to this, with a specific group of parents being formed to be explicitly anti things like critical race theory. And this has miffed a particular teacher in this case, and I'll try to get to that point. So it is a particular former educator, Beth Parts, actually, is the educator who was completely miffed about this and got to the point of saying, well, we don't really want to have people criticizing us or questioning our methods. So what we're going to do is we're going to find, and it's worth it to mention that even in this particular school district, this Beth Bart's character was actually censored by them for being too antagonistic to parents who were pro-school openings and anti-frickin' critical race theory. But this person has done a lot of just kind of borderline criminal things, wanting people to have action, calling for actions to do things like gather information of people in this, as she calls it, anti-CRT movement. She wants to infiltrate these groups, spread information, essentially dox these people, and also find a way to gather donations for all of this nonsense. And she was even looking for hackers at one point. It is so ridiculous, this story. It is, I can't understate it. There has been so much going on, and this is another aspect of cancel culture. This is the actually build-up to something that that would actually be more accurately termed, rather than cancel culture. Rather, it is more accurately termed as a struggle session. What this person wants to do, what this teacher wants to do, is to force these parents to grovel at the feet of her communistic ideas, to grovel at the feet of these people who are pro all of this sort of stuff, this critical race theory, this collectivism, this communism. And by the way, do not let people say, oh, well, cancel culture it's bad, but don't call them communists. Not all of them are communists, don't use communism as a blanket term. Completely ignoring in this instance that they are using explicitly communist tactics. What is a cancel culture? What was, for as a good example that has happened recently, what was the After the Rose ceremony of The Bachelor that was explicitly dedicated to berating someone and forcing them to apologize and grovel for going to a party that was iconographically similar to a particular point in time that existed, but which had bad things that were also going on during that time? What is that other than a struggle session? Something which has been, by the way, happening in the US for literally decades. It's been happening since, well, around the 40s at the earliest, at least the earliest incident I know of. It could have been happening even earlier. The homegrown, quote-unquote, communistic movement in the US of A was, first of all, funded by the Soviet Union by and large, and that itself being a huge problem. There are many things that they did that were also tactically very similar to the Soviet Union, which you would expect considering they were funded by the people. Many people back in the day were put through struggle sessions, things that were later described in China as being much more physical encounters, but in this case involved a lot more mental hardship and a lot more mentally breaking down the victims of such. That is what has occurred even more often and even more openly and in public venues nowadays. All cancel culture is, in truth, is communistic struggle sessions, communistic tactics being used out in the open, because they have no longer are they going to hide in the darkness. No longer are they going to do these things behind closed doors. They are no longer going to do that. They are going to do it out in the open, and they're not only going to attempt to get people who are communists to capitulate to these struggle sessions, but also people who are not communists, because they think they have an in, because they think they're out in the open. Or that would be what I would say if I was a black pillar. I don't think that they actually think they have a particular open. Well, they might, but I think it has more to do with the fact that they are getting desperate. For the longest time in America, many people who would conduct these cancel culture segments and these struggle sessions in secret had a large measure of control over places like Hollywood and much of the media and all of these sorts of cultural institutions. If you haven't noticed over the past 20 years or so, that grip, that absolute vice grip on all of media has kind of waned. The fact that a show like mine can exist without any supervision from these people who would conduct these sorts of things in many newsrooms, the fact that this show can exist at all is quite good evidence of such. Even many cultural aspects are being ripped away from the communist hands. In many cases, a good example of this as well is actually Daily Wire. They are doing many good cultural stuff. They are doing books. They are doing things like making movies at this point. They're doing many things, and they're continuing to expand on that sort of stuff. It is very good, but don't call it conservative media. I wouldn't want people to call any media that is not woke as conservative media or right-leaning media. It is simply non-political media. The difference between something like a woke piece of media, something like, say, Marvel Comics, and a more independent comic from a more right-leaning author is not, in fact, the politics itself, or the fact that one is left-leaning politics and the other is right-leaning politics. The difference is that one pushes politics into your face and the other doesn't, and it compels itself mostly by simply being good. That is what has occurred. And that is what will inevitably overtake all of these institutions, and that is why they are doing cancel culture struggle sessions in public rather than in private. That is why. Because they are losing their grip, and this is their last resort. Or one of their last resorts. I would imagine their last resort would actually be starting a revolution, though we are just a couple of steps from that point. We're still not there quite yet, or at least I would argue so. And, I think that's all for today. If you liked the video, do in fact look down and subscribe. Go and support the work. Also, if you really want to support it, do share. Sharing is great. It's wonderful. I do quite like it. And below that, you have many links, very pretty links down in the description, especially for you YouTube heathens who continue to use that awful platform. Go somewhere else. There are many links. BitChute, Odyssey, all those sorts of places are much better platforms. And if you want to see my thoughts or sometimes see where everywhere I'm putting my videos that day, go to my Parler, Gab, and particularly my Minds page, where I do quite like to put my thoughts rather than just put my videos, at least on occasion. And that is where I'm going to leave you off. I am Kel Kidman. This has been Breaking on the Daily, and I'm out.